Hi there. I'm Chris Crescent. This is Talking Tsundoka Blues. This is my neighbor's cat. A few days ago, there was a new biography of Robert Crumb released, and it got me thinking about the man. And actually, this year, it has been 20 years since the Robert Crumb Handbook was released. This book still stands as a very solid and all-encompassing introduction to one of the strangest outsider artists and counterculture icons in American history. In a way, it's an autobiography that he wrote with Peter Poplaski. If you're not familiar with the compulsive comics scribbler, that's comics with an X, then this self-professed, twisted, perverted curmudgeon, known for a time as America's best-loved underground cartoonist, well, there's nothing that can really prepare you for his work. Although this cover does a pretty good job.
I'm not here to be polite. I don't know why I make R. Crumb talk like that. He doesn't talk like that, but doesn't he just look like that kind of curmudgeon? I'm not here to be polite. Okay, and then on the back side, this has got kind of a ugly sticker on there, so let's look at the... Actually, the inside is just exactly the same. That's a little bit faded, isn't it? Yeah, anyway. Canary yellow. There we go, that's better. And remember, it's only lines on paper, folks.
This is probably my favorite reader, besides, I don't know, maybe the Burroughs reader or Bukowski's Run with the Hunted. And speaking of Bukowski, he actually factors in here a little bit.
The poet Charles Bukowski's career and work are a good example. I met him through Robert Williams at a party in LA in the early 1970s, and he gave me a piece of advice. He said, "Your stuff is good, kid. Just stay away from the cocktail parties." He was right. Bukowski had observed that successful artists and writers get spoiled by all the lavish attention, especially from rich people, bourgeoisie people, and then they don't have anything to say anymore. They get bought off, basically. The last thing I want is to be someone who is constantly being gawked at and trotted out like some fucking celebrity. Horrible. Sure, I always wanted to get recognition for my work, but I prefer to be the anonymous observer on the sidelines. I never had any desire to be America's best-loved underground cartoonist. That was supposed to be a joke, not my life.
So, let's take a look inside. As you can see, there's a free CD inside.
And beneath the CD... This CD contains selections recorded by the various groups that R. Crumb has enjoyed playing with during his long, half-assed musical career, from 1972 to 2003. And you can see the list of performances there on the inside of the inside cover. The man himself. Yes, sir, every drawing a masterpiece. Check it out. So take a look at the table of contents here. This is arranged in 4 sections, according to the Toltec Indians' 4 enemies of man: fear, clarity, power, and old age. And there's some of the previous publications of Crumb. A lot of beautiful images in here. Despite the size of this book, the quality is really good. Forward, A Well-Plowed Field. This is by Poplaski. This is one of the most famous wordless comics that Crumb did, called A Short History of America. And you can see this one in the 1994 film as well. Nice quote here by James Howard Kunstler from his book The Geography of Nowhere, published in 1993. The spread of slums, the hypergrowth and congestion of manufacturing cities, the noise and stench of the industrial process debased urban life all over the Western world and led to a great yearning for escape. In America, with its superabundance of cheap land, simple property laws, social mobility, mania for profit, zest for practical invention, and Bible-drunk sense of history, the yearning to escape industrialism expressed itself as a renewed search for Eden. America reinvented that paradise, described so briefly and vaguely in the book of Genesis, called it suburbia, and put it up for sale. I just kind of go with the flow. So in chapter 1, Poor Claude, Robert Crumb talks about being a collector. He collected everything as a kid: matchbooks, bottle caps, marbles, cardboard milk bottle tops, old playing cards, and of course comic books. And these are the Crumb children: Sandra, Maxon, Robert, Charles, and Carol. And Robert Crumb's oldest brother, Charles, will factor very big into his life. It was because of him that Crumb began drawing comics. This is kind of interesting here. He talks about the Howdy Doody show and the Buffalo Bob Smith, who was the puppeteer of Howdy Doody. There were a bunch of puppet and marionette kids shows on early TV that made a deep impression on me, because in spite of the adult assumption that these puppets were cute and lovable, they were actually grotesque. Howdy Doody was an alien being, and the way puppets moved was bizarre and dreamlike. Clarabelle Clown was scary. My wife Aline tells a coming-of-age moment in her life when she was 8 years old and got to be a guest in the Peanut Gallery on the Howdy Doody show. She saw the world the adults were trying to present to children, and the reality behind the scenes were two different things. Buffalo Bob, the adult star of the Howdy Doody show, off camera, was mean and scowling, but as soon as the camera was on, he was all smiles. "Hey kids, what time is it? It's Howdy Doody time!" Everybody off camera was sleazy and stressed out. You had this uneasy feeling as a kid that something was going on that they were not showing you, something that was ugly. Adults were hiding something from us, and that's such a fascinating thing, the adult interpretation of the kids' world, a world artificially sweetened for kids, full of things kids were supposed to like and want. We sat in front of the television on Saturday mornings and looked at kids' stuff. The shows tried to tell kids that life could be fun and exciting, but the unconscious message was that the adult world was strange, twisted, and perverse, threatening and sinister. And then he talks about how his brother was hypersensitive to this. There's an interesting letter here that Charles Crumb, his older brother, wrote to Robert Crumb in 1989, just a little before the documentary was made. It's called The Litany of Fear. And it talks about how he was afraid of everything as a kid. He was afraid of insects and snakes. He was afraid of cars and trucks. He was afraid of the atomic bombs. He was afraid of bridges. He was afraid of crayons. He was afraid of forests and woods. He was afraid to sleep because he would have nightmares. He was afraid of caves, basements, and attics. He was afraid of taking his clothes off in front of other people, afraid of hospitals, afraid of doctors, dentists, and nurses, afraid of criminals and murderers, afraid of sex, afraid of the boogeyman, afraid of elderly men and elderly women, afraid of God, afraid of Jesus Christ. Though Jesus Christ himself never would have deliberately instilled fear into children, he has been used and is used as a medium by others to instill fear in them. He was afraid of the Holy Ghost, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the other saints. He was afraid of hell. He was afraid of the devil. He was afraid of purgatory. He was afraid of girls, of other boys. He was afraid of even Robert himself, and afraid of his sisters, afraid of mother, and most of all, he was terrified of his father. And so he ends this with, perhaps all these things that I was afraid of were simply projections, as it were, of the old man. Really, really powerful stuff. Charles Crumb, dressed as Long John Silver from Treasure Island. Treasure Island, that had a huge effect on them. I mentioned Bukowski earlier. Crumb talks about, in one of his stories, Charles Bukowski describes how a schoolyard mentality affects the world we live in, meaning everyone has to go through cruel hazing and testing rituals. You just can't be too goddamn sensitive in this world. I was too fucking sensitive. And of course, Charles was as well. This is kind of heartbreaking. When I was a boy, I believed in my father. Hey Dad, you almost forgot your briefcase. Thanks, Bobby. Glad you reminded me. Will my own son say the same thing about me? So Robert Crumb's father was a very kind of a tyrant, and everyone was terrified of him. He had a raging temper. Robert Crumb himself has drawn comics based on his father, White Man, which is a kind of a caricature of the 1950s American dad and his repressed desires. Some really great sketches in here. The guy with the bass drum who used to come through the neighborhood slowly down the middle of the street. Boom, boom, boom. You could hear him coming 2 or 3 blocks away. Us little kids were terrified of him and would run in the house until he passed by. I only actually saw him once. The first time was enough for me. My mother said he was walking through the neighborhood beating that bass drum when she was a little girl.
Crumb's mind, a nest of trauma and compulsions, split open wide by LSD, embraced the chaos of the late 1960s San Francisco scene and the counterculture movement, and he made himself a place there on the fringe. Although he didn't really fit in, he wasn't a hippie or a beatnik. What was he? Well, he was always trying to escape into comics, records, sex, all of his compulsions.
Oh, I love this too. The 7 chakras of R. Crumb. Nothing happening. Inactive, not in service, out of order. Vanity, ego, half-baked notions. Pettifoggery. Depression, bitterness, morbidity, self-pity, despair. Fear, anxiety, greed, acquisitiveness. Anal obsessive compulsiveness, uptightness, timidity. Sexual obsession, perversion, fetishism, sadomasochism.
The drugs he was taking, which was mainly LSD and marijuana, mostly stopped by 1973, and Crumb entered into one of the most productive periods of his entire life. It could be that watching his brothers unravel with acid and their other mental disorders had an effect on him, or maybe his life had just become too chaotic to withstand. The one thing he always made sure of was that he kept drawing at all costs. Crumb dug deeper and deeper into himself to dig out his art, and thus went beyond any of his contemporaries, digging into the absolute raw truth of American culture and the twists and turns of the collective psyche. Obviously, it was relatable to many people, and he really drew a place for himself, especially at a time when there was no place for someone like him. And the underground comics world really allowed him to survive and thrive by ripping out and displaying all of his demons, his nightmares, his fantasies, his thoughts on society, politics. And it's amazing that people embraced him and shared his vision. Now he's being shown in art galleries all over the world, which is kind of unthinkable for someone like that who's truly an outsider. It's interesting and strange to see how he's been embraced over the decades.
My favorite character here, Mr. Natural. I love Mr. Natural because he's sort of this faux guru who's always dispensing, supposed wisdom, which actually is sometimes wisdom and is actually sometimes bullshit. And it's always clever and entertaining. I forgot to mention that this collection comes with a bookmark. And then there's actually a really interesting thing in here about he had this comic, White Man Meets Bigfoot, and they turned it into a play, and then Hollywood kept trying to make a movie of it, especially after the Fritz the Cat movie was fairly successful. And Crumb claims that old TV show, Harry and the Hendersons, is a direct ripoff of his White Man Meets Bigfoot play, which I find very strange and probably true, because that idea is so weird, it probably only came from Robert Crumb. And then the middle to end of the book is basically him living with his wife, Aline. They lived in California for a while. They had an open marriage, and they drew comics together. And then they moved to the south of France. And actually, that's where the documentary film ends, is they're moving away from the U.S. And Crumb, to this day, has not returned. He does visit the U.S. from time to time, but he never actually has lived there since. So I think Aline and moving away really sort of saved him. He was able to raise his daughter and find a quieter life in France.
Personally, I think that art should not be easy. I think it should actively engage with the viewer, with the audience, and it should tackle difficult questions that cannot be asked in other areas of life. Crumb's work pushes beyond any conceivable limitations, and it dares you to look or look away, as the case may be. This book is very much a companion to the 1994 documentary film Crumb. I had just watched the film again last night while I was kind of thinking about this video and thinking about this book. And I thought like how inseparable they are. It's kind of redundant actually in a way. I like to think of them as two sides of the same coin. It's not that I'm not interested in Dan Nadel's new biography of Crumb. It's just that I feel like I know R. Crumb so well from his work, from the film, from this reader, and just reading his comics over the years. But if you don't feel like investing in a big long biography of Robert Crumb, I would highly recommend the R. Crumb Handbook, because it's little. I mean, it's fat, but it's little, and you can carry it around. It's got some of his best work in here. Really insightful commentary on who he is and what made him become the way that he is still today.
Okay, the thing that I want to talk about the most back here is the final page. This is the final page before he gives his kind of his universe of art, and there's an index here. But basically, the final page he gives to Bukowski, which I'm a fan of Bukowski. I really appreciated this. This is from Charles Bukowski's book Hollywood, written in 1989.
Bukowski, of course, another underground artist of words. The two of them have mined similar territory, especially in terms of women, and both of them share this powerful outsider status, speaking their mind while being mostly ignored by the media, especially in the early days, but weirdly, briefly embraced by Hollywood, and of course millions of fans worldwide.
There's also a companion to the Litany of Fear written by his brother. This is written by Crumb himself, talking about how he's a negative person and all of the things that he hates, which is basically everything. But it ends with, the thing that I like the most about this is it ends with a quote by Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, who famously said, "Hell is other people," to which Crumb adds, "Hell is also yourself." And I think that's quite clever and also true.
It's kind of amazing that work this difficult and controversial would even find an audience, let alone rise to the level that it has, speaking about both Crumb and Bukowski. But I can't help but wonder, will there ever be artists like them again in the future? Is it possible for this kind of person to come out, especially in the age that we live in or wherever this crazy culture is going? I mean, of course, there will never be another R. Crumb, but will there be someone like that in the future who challenges the norms and questions the media and tries to fight against the gigantic machine that we're all trapped inside of? I hope so, but who knows? I'd like to hope that no matter how the culture shifts, there will always be outsider artists asking those difficult questions and challenging us to keep us aware, keep us awake, and keep us authentic. I mean, you can't argue with what's real. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again.